you are sitting right now, maybe on a couch, maybe at a desk, maybe in bed, holding a small glowing rectangle that your ancestors would have worshipped as a god if they had ever seen anything like it, and you feel human. Completely, totally human, civilized, modern, far removed from anything that crawls or swings through trees. But here is what nobody told you in school: 0.98.7% of your DNA is identical to a chimpanzee, not similar, not related, identical. The same molecular instructions that build a chimpanzee's brain are building yours right now, this second, as you sit there. The same genetic sequences that wire a chimp's social hierarchies, its jealousy, its need for status, are running silently inside your nervous system at this exact moment, shaping decisions you think are entirely your own. Scientists like Dr. Franz de Waal spent over 4 decades watching chimpanzees in captivity and in the wild. And the longer he watched them, the more uncomfortable the data became. Because chimpanzees do not just share your DNA, they share your politics, your grudges, your need to be respected, your tendency to remember an insult for years while forgetting 100 kindnesses. The question was never when humans stopped being animals. The question is whether we ever did. Let's go back, way back, not thousands of years. Millions, roughly 6 to 7 million years ago, somewhere in what is now Central Africa, a population of primates began to split into two distinct lines. One branch continued on a path that would eventually produce modern chimpanzees and bonobos. The other branch began a long, strange, accidental journey that would eventually produce you. 6 million years sounds like an almost unimaginable stretch of time. And in human terms it is. But in evolutionary terms, it is closer to a rounding error. For comparison, sharks have existed in roughly their current form for around 400 million years. They watched the dinosaurs arrive and disappear. Crocodiles have barely changed in 80 million years. Their ancestors were already perfecting the art of waiting motionless in water long before the first primate ever stood upright. Modern Homo sapiens, the species you belong to, has existed for somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years. Geologically speaking, you are brand new. You are the newest experiment evolution has run on this particular branch of the primate family tree, and the results are still very much pending. Brand new means unfinished. It means built quickly, under pressure, without the luxury of careful design. Your brain is not a modern machine engineered for the world you currently live in. It is an ancient machine, assembled piece by piece over millions of years to survive a completely different environment, and it is now running, somewhat awkwardly, in a world full of traffic, fluorescent lighting, and notifications. Dr. Robert Sapolsky, a neuroendocrinologist at Stanford University, has spent his career studying the biological roots of human behavior. His research keeps arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. The parts of your brain responsible for your irrational fears, your tribal loyalties, your impulsive decisions are not malfunctions. They are not glitches in an otherwise perfect system. They are features. They were built by natural selection because for hundreds of thousands of years, they kept your ancestors alive long enough to reproduce. The problem is simple to state and difficult to live with. Your ancestors are gone. The world that shaped their brains no longer exists. But their software is still running inside you, making decisions, generating emotions, and shaping behavior, often without your conscious awareness. Here is where it gets specific. Think about the last time someone cut you off in traffic. Not a near miss, just an ordinary, mildly rude driving maneuver. Your heart rate spiked within a fraction of a second. Your jaw may have tightened. Your hands likely gripped the wheel a little harder. Some part of you, for just a moment, wanted to retaliate, to honk, to tailgate, to somehow restore balance to a situation that objectively cost you almost nothing. That was not you reacting rationally to a stranger operating a vehicle. That was a 6 million-year-old primate brain reacting to what it interpreted as a dominance challenge. In chimpanzee society, when a lower-ranking individual crosses the path of a higher-ranking one without displaying appropriate deference, it can trigger an immediate and visible threat response. Status must be defended. Territory must be respected. The hierarchy, fragile and constantly tested, must be reinforced through small daily confrontations. You do not live in a forest. You do not have a biological hierarchy enforced through displays of physical dominance. But your brain does not know that. As far as your nervous system is concerned, the rules have not changed. Now think about something closer to your daily life. Social media, every morning, all over the world, millions of people wake up and almost immediately reach for their phones to check who responded to them overnight, who liked the post, who commented, who left them on read. The small spike of anxiety when you are ignored, and the small spike of pleasure when you are acknowledged, are not modern inventions created by software engineers in California. They are ancient primate social monitoring systems, originally designed to track your standing within a group of perhaps 50 to 150 individuals. now running inside an application designed to keep you scrolling for as long as possible. Dr. DeWall documented a behavior in chimpanzees that researchers now call consolation behavior. When one chimpanzee lost a fight or appeared distressed, other chimpanzees, sometimes even ones not closely related to the upset individual, would approach, sit beside them, and groom them gently. There was no immediate practical benefit to this behavior. It did not provide food, it did not increase status, it simply offered comfort. You do something remarkably similar. When a friend is visibly upset, you do not calculate the most efficient response. You sit beside them. You put a hand on their shoulder or their back. You make soft sounds and say things that carry little practical information, but signal something deeper: presence, safety, solidarity. Nobody taught you this directly. No parent sat you down and explained the mechanics of comforting another human being in distress. It arrived already installed, encoded somewhere in that 98.7%. But here is the part that most people misunderstand entirely: the 3% of your DNA that differs from a chimpanzee's is not what most people assume it is. It is not raw intelligence. Chimpanzees solve complex multi-step problems. They use tools, sometimes crafting them for specific purposes. They teach their offspring skills through observation and repetition. They appear to plan ahead, storing food or tools for later use. It is not emotional depth either. Chimpanzees grieve their dead, sometimes carrying a deceased infant for days. They celebrate reunions with displays of joy. They form bonds that can last decades, bonds that show every sign of something we would recognize, in a human context, as friendship or even love. It is not even language in the strictest sense. Chimpanzees raised in research settings, like the famous case of Washoe, have learned hundreds of signs in American Sign Language and have used them spontaneously in novel combinations to communicate desires, observations, and even what researchers interpreted as jokes. So if it is not intelligence, not emotion, and not language, what exactly is the 1.3%? Primarily, it concerns one specific, narrow, but extraordinarily powerful capability: cooperation with strangers. Dr. Michael Tomasello, a developmental psychologist formerly at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, ran a series of comparative experiments examining cooperative behavior in human children versus chimpanzees. In one notable set of trials, two individuals needed to work together, pulling on separate ropes simultaneously to bring a reward within reach. When chimpanzee pairs succeeded, the dominant or stronger individual would typically attempt to take the entire reward, even when this clearly disadvantaged the cooperating partner. Conflict frequently followed unequal distribution. Human children, including those as young as 3 years old, behaved differently. When two children worked together to obtain a reward, they spontaneously and consistently attempted to divide it equally, even without adult instruction, even when an unequal split would have been easy to justify or get away with. Chimpanzees cooperate readily within their immediate social circle, with kin, with allies they have known for years, with individuals whose loyalty has already been tested and proven. Humans cooperate with strangers, with people they have never met and will likely never meet again, with people who speak unfamiliar languages, follow unfamiliar customs, worship different gods, or hold passports from countries on the opposite side of the planet. That capacity, fragile and recent in evolutionary terms, is the mutation. That is the 1.3%. Not a larger brain, although your brain is indeed larger relative to body size than a chimpanzee's. Not more dexterous hands, although your opposable thumbs are remarkably refined. The defining difference is the ability to extend trust to a complete stranger, enough to build something together that neither individual could build alone. And that single capability built everything you recognize as civilization. Every city was built by strangers cooperating. Every trade route connected people who would never personally meet, exchanging goods based on networks of trust extending across continents. Every hospital exists because thousands of strangers, separated by generations, agreed to specialize, to study, to fund, to build, trusting that other strangers would do the same in return. Every library represents an unspoken agreement among countless people, most long dead, that knowledge should be preserved and shared beyond the boundaries of any single family or tribe. But here is the genuinely counterintuitive part, the part that should make you slightly uncomfortable. That cooperative capacity is not stable. It is not guaranteed. And your underlying chimpanzee brain seems to know this instinctively. When you encounter someone from a clearly different group, a different nationality, a different political affiliation, a different team, even a rival school, the ancient 98, 7% quietly activates a low-level alarm. This individual is not kin. This individual has not been vetted as an ally. Proceed with caution. The default setting embedded deep in your nervous system is not trust. It is caution, sometimes bordering on suspicion. You have to consciously, deliberately override that default. Every single time you choose to trust someone unfamiliar, every act of genuine cooperation toward a stranger, represents you actively overriding roughly 6 million years of accumulated primate caution. Every time you help someone you will likely never encounter again. Every time you follow a rule simply because it is right, even when no one would notice if you broke it. Every time you cooperate with someone your ancient instincts might classify as a competitor or a threat, you are doing something that chimpanzees, for all their intelligence and emotional depth, simply do not do at scale. That is not a minor footnote in human history. That is civilization, in its entirety, resting on a biological foundation barely a few 100,000 years old, layered thinly over a much older, much more cautious animal mind. Dr. Sapolsky has a particular observation that tends to stay with people long after they first hear it. He notes that humans are capable of more sustained kindness, more genuine altruism, more selfless generosity toward total strangers than any other species on this planet. And in the very same breath, he notes that humans are also capable of more prolonged, more organized, more deliberately engineered cruelty than any other species on this planet. Both extraordinary capacities, the saintly and the monstrous, emerge from precisely the same biological source. The 1.3% does not simply add new, gentler behaviors on top of the older 98.7%. It amplifies everything already present. It takes ancient tribal loyalty and turns it into either humanitarian solidarity or genocidal nationalism, depending entirely on how it is directed. It takes ancient status seeking and turns it into either inspiring leadership or ruthless tyranny. You are not simply a chimpanzee who happened to learn how to talk. You are a chimpanzee who learned to build both churches and concentration camps, both libraries and bomb factories, both hospitals that heal strangers for free and torture chambers designed with horrifying precision. The 98.7% never disappears. It is always present, quietly monitoring for status threats, tracking the social hierarchy, instinctively protecting whatever group you currently identify with, calculating, often unconsciously, who owes what to whom within your social circle. The 1.3% is also always present, offering you, in every single moment, a choice: to override the ancient caution or to act on it, to extend trust beyond your immediate circle or to retreat into tribal suspicion, to build something that outlasts your own individual existence or to simply survive the day in front of you. Consider for a moment why certain things still affect you so powerfully, despite seeming, on the surface, completely irrational in a modern context. Why do you still feel a flicker of unease walking alone down a poorly lit street, even in a country with extremely low crime rates? Because for nearly the entire history of your species, darkness genuinely meant increased danger from predators and rival groups, and that calculation became etched into the architecture of your nervous system long before streetlights existed. Why does the sight or smell of certain foods, particularly sugar and fat, trigger such an immediate, almost involuntary craving? Because for the vast majority of human evolutionary history, calorie-dense food was scarce and unpredictable, and any individual whose brain rewarded the consumption of rare, high-energy food with intense pleasure had a significant survival advantage. Your brain has not yet updated this reward system for a world of constant abundance. Why do you instinctively scan a room upon entering it, even in a perfectly safe environment like a coffee shop or a classroom? Because situational awareness, constantly checking for threats, exits, and the positions of other individuals, was once a matter of life and death, not idle habit. Why does public speaking trigger physiological responses similar to actual physical danger? Elevated heart rate, sweating, a tightening in the chest, even though no genuine physical threat exists? Because for most of human history, being rejected, shamed, or expelled from your social group in front of an audience could realistically mean death through isolation, predation, or starvation. Your nervous system has not received the memo that public failure today carries dramatically lower stakes. These are not character flaws. These are not signs of weakness or irrationality. These are simply visible traces of the 98.7%, expressing itself in a world it was never designed to navigate. Understanding this changes something important. It does not excuse poor behavior, but it explains it. It reveals why willpower alone often fails against deeply ingrained instincts, and why understanding the underlying biology can succeed where pure self-criticism cannot. When you find yourself irrationally angry at a stranger online, someone you will never meet, defending an opinion with far more intensity than the situation logically deserves, you are witnessing ancient tribal defense mechanisms misfiring in a digital environment they were never built to handle. The chimpanzee brain interprets disagreement from an unfamiliar voice as a status challenge requiring an immediate forceful response. When you feel an inexplicable surge of belonging and pride watching a sports team, you have no personal connection to win a championship. You are witnessing ancient coalition building instincts, originally designed to strengthen bonds within a small hunting or defending group, now activated by a television broadcast and a jersey color. When you experience genuine grief over the death of a public figure you never personally met, you are witnessing the same neural machinery that once mourned the loss of an actual tribe member, someone whose survival was directly tied to your own. None of this makes you less human. If anything, it makes you more thoroughly, completely human, in the sense that humanity itself has never meant the absence of animal instinct. It has always meant the presence of something additional, layered carefully and precariously on top. So, where does this leave you, sitting wherever you happen to be sitting right now, having just learned that the vast majority of your genetic blueprint is functionally identical to a primate swinging through a forest canopy on the other side of the world? It leaves you exactly where you have always been, caught between two systems running simultaneously inside the same skull. One system, ancient and powerful, optimized for survival in small competitive groups facing scarcity and danger. The other system, recent and fragile, optimized for cooperation, trust, and the construction of things larger than any single individual or tribe. Neither system is fake. Neither system is the real you, while the other is some kind of costume. Both are entirely, authentically you, operating together, sometimes in harmony, often in tension. The 98.7% gave you the capacity to survive an unforgiving world for hundreds of thousands of years. It gave you fear, which kept you alive. It gave you tribal loyalty, which kept your group cohesive. It gave you status seeking, which organized complex societies long before written law existed. The 1.3% gave you something rarer and, in evolutionary terms, astonishingly new: the capacity to look at someone entirely unlike yourself and choose, deliberately, consciously, to cooperate anyway. Consider, for a moment, what this means for how you raise children, build relationships, and structure entire societies. Dr. Sarah Hardy, an anthropologist who has spent decades studying primate and human child rearing, points out something that should fundamentally change how you think about human nature. Among great apes, infant care falls almost entirely on the biological mother. A chimpanzee mother carries, feeds, and protects her infant largely alone, with minimal assistance from other group members. Human infants, by contrast, are raised through what researchers call cooperative breeding. Mothers, fathers, grandparents, older siblings, aunts, uncles, and in many traditional societies, unrelated community members, all contribute directly to keeping a single child alive and developing. Hardy argues that this distributed caregiving system, unique among great apes, may be one of the central evolutionary pressures that selected for your species' extraordinary capacity for cooperation and trust. In other words, the 1.3% may have been forged, quite literally, in the act of trusting other people with your own children, a behavior that, from a purely competitive evolutionary standpoint, should never have worked. And yet it did repeatedly, successfully, for hundreds of thousands of years. This explains something strange about modern life that often goes unexamined. Why do humans form such intense bonds with people who share absolutely no genetic relationship to them? Why does a teacher feel genuine pride watching a student succeed? Why does a stranger dive into a river to save a drowning child they have never met? From a narrow chimpanzee-style evolutionary logic, none of this makes sense. Resources spent helping unrelated individuals should, in theory, be resources wasted, resources that could have gone toward your own genetic survival instead. But the 1.3% rewired the entire calculation. It built a brain that experiences genuine reward, not calculated reward, but actual neurochemical pleasure, from helping individuals who share none of your genes and will likely never repay you directly. Dr. James Rilling at Emory University used brain imaging technology to study what happens neurologically when people choose to cooperate with strangers in controlled economic games. He found that cooperative choices activated the same reward circuitry in the brain, the same regions associated with pleasure from food or social approval, as purely selfish choices did for less cooperative individuals. Your brain, in other words, was rebuilt to find cooperation itself rewarding, not merely tolerable, not simply useful. Genuinely, neurologically pleasurable. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive finding in this entire area of research. You were not designed by evolution to be selfish, with cooperation as a reluctant compromise. For a meaningful subset of human behavior, you were designed to find genuine joy in helping others, even strangers, even when there is no possibility of repayment. That does not mean selfishness, tribalism, and status seeking have disappeared. They have not. The 98.7% is still fully operational, still running constantly in the background. But it means the 1.3% is not simply a thin, fragile veneer painted over an essentially selfish animal. It is a fully integrated, biologically rewarded system, every bit as real and as powerful as the ancient instincts it sits alongside. Now think about what happens when these two systems come into direct conflict, because this happens to you more often than you probably realize. Imagine you are at work, and a colleague from a different department, someone you barely know, asks for help on a project that will not benefit you directly and will cost you several hours of unpaid effort. Your 98.7% immediately calculates the cost: time lost, energy spent. No clear benefit to your own status or survival, but your 1.3% is also calculating something entirely different: the simple, neurologically rewarding experience of being useful, of contributing to something larger than your immediate self-interest, of being seen, even briefly, as someone trustworthy and capable. Most people experience this exact tension dozens of times per week, often without consciously labeling it. The slight hesitation before agreeing to help a stranger, the quick mental calculation before holding a door open, before answering a question from someone you do not know, before offering directions to a confused tourist. In nearly every one of these small moments, you are not simply being polite. You are actively choosing between two ancient, deeply embedded systems, both of which are authentically, completely you. This same tension scales up dramatically when applied to entire societies, which is perhaps why human history looks the way it does: an almost dizzying oscillation between extraordinary cooperation and extraordinary conflict, often within the same generation, sometimes within the same individual life. The same biological machinery that allowed early human communities to build irrigation systems requiring coordination among hundreds of unrelated families is the same machinery that, when redirected toward perceived outsiders, has fueled some of history's most devastating conflicts. Dr. Sapolsky often notes that the line between in-group and out-group, the boundary that determines whether your 1.3% extends trust or your 98.7% activates suspicion, can be manipulated astonishingly easily. In laboratory experiments, simply assigning people to arbitrary groups, based on something as meaningless as a coin flip, was enough to trigger measurable in-group favoritism and out-group suspicion within minutes. This single fact carries enormous implications for how you understand conflict, prejudice, and cooperation in the modern world. The boundaries of who counts as a trusted stranger, deserving of your 1.3% cooperative instincts, versus who counts as a threatening outsider, triggering your 98.7% defensive instincts, are not fixed by biology. They are remarkably flexible, shaped heavily by culture, language, shared symbols, and deliberate social engineering. For better or worse, this means something important and, in many ways, hopeful. If tribal boundaries can be constructed artificially and rapidly, as countless historical examples of manufactured conflict demonstrate, they can also be deliberately expanded. Communities and societies that successfully built broader circles of trust, extending cooperative instincts beyond family, beyond tribe, beyond nation, were not somehow defying their biology. They were activating a different, equally biological, equally ancient part of that same 1.3%. Every successful large-scale human cooperation, from international scientific collaborations mapping the human genome, to global health initiatives eliminating diseases like smallpox, to simple acts of strangers helping strangers after a natural disaster, represents a direct, measurable triumph of the 1.3% over the default caution embedded in the 98.7%. So when you find yourself frustrated by what feels like irrational human behavior, whether in yourself or in others, impulsive anger, tribal loyalty that defies logic, status anxiety over things that objectively do not matter, you are not witnessing a broken or flawed species. You are witnessing an extremely young species, barely a few 100,000 years into its existence, still actively negotiating the relationship between two powerful, ancient, and sometimes contradictory biological systems. Right now, somewhere in a forest in Central Africa, a chimpanzee is sitting on a branch, doing something that, to an outside observer with no biological training, might look remarkably similar to what you are doing right this second. Resting, observing, perhaps even, in its own way, thinking. The difference between you and that chimpanzee is far smaller than you were ever taught to believe, but it is large enough, and every single day, in ways large and small, often without even realizing it, you get to decide which side of that difference you choose to live on.